Hey fam, Kisky here. Welcome to Photography 101 Part 1. We're going to be starting a series where we're going to be learning about the photography basics, all the simple and necessary things you must know to become a professional photographer. And today we're going to be learning the exposure triangle, the foundational element to photography. So when it comes to photography, there is nothing more important than the exposure triangle. I cannot stress it enough how important it is for you to master the exposure triangle, especially when you're going to do manual photography, when you're going to set the camera yourself. So in other words, these classes are going to be for those who want to take photography to the next level away from the automatic modes. When you learn the manual modes using things like the aperture priority modes and the shutter priority modes, is very easy. So you need to learn the manual bit first. Before we get started, what is photography? Understanding what photography is will help you understand why the exposure triangle is important. My teacher, the person who taught me photography, always told me or taught me that photography is rewriting light. It's a very simple but profound definition. Why? The word light. When you don't have light, when you try to take a photo in darkness, the camera won't shoot because there's no light. But at the ounce of light, the camera will snap onto that light and take the photo. So it's important to understand light, because without light, photography isn't. Once you understand that definition, we move on to what we call the exposure triangle. Now the exposure triangle, like you hear it, it's a triangle, meaning there are three sides to it. So these three elements help you control and adjust the amount of light that you're letting into your camera, and also they also have another aspect to it. I call it the duality of the exposure triangle. Each of these elements, besides controlling light, they have something that they do. I like to call it on the artistic side of your photo. So understanding the exposure triangle is very key. So what are these three elements? The three elements are the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. When you look at a camera, you realize that light moves in a certain flow, and I want you to understand this direction because it helps along the way, especially make things easier. The first thing it deals with is a lens, and when it passes through the lens, it then goes to the camera body. All the three elements of the exposure triangle are along this line, and the first element that your light deals with is the aperture, since it's found on the lens. Now I have a lens here that I'll use for study purposes. There's a small opening that you see in the lens right there. That opening is the aperture opening. That's the opening that allows in light to your camera. The cameras of all the DSLRs used to have a real mirror, a physical mirror that would open and close. Now that is your shutter speed, right? The speed at which that mirror opens and closes to allow in light and then to close, right? So that's shutter speed. And then your camera has what we call a sensor. When you have a mirrorless camera, it's what you see the sensor. But if you had a DSLR, you would see the mirror, and behind that you would see the sensor. But now in our mirrorless cameras, you would see the sensor directly because the shutter speed is electronic. The sensor is where we find the ISO. Pretty simple, right? So aperture on the lens, shutter speed, and then ISO. And that is the order with which we're going to learn the exposure triangle. So the first thing, aperture. Now aperture is measured in f-stops. When you look at your lens, again, when you read on your lens, usually you will find that there is a reading where you have the focal length of the lens, but usually you'll also have a reading where you'll see your aperture, which is that f and then the number. So apertures can be fixed, where a lens has a fixed aperture like 2.8 or f1.2, f1.8. Then some have a variable aperture. The variable aperture is one where you can find the figure being like 4.5 to 6.3 or 4.5 to 5.6. Now what does a variable aperture mean? The more you zoom in, as you zoom in, your highest aperture changes, meaning when you are 28, you could shoot at that f4.5, but once you reach about 80, which is the end of this one, you cannot go as high as 4.5. I'm sure you've heard me saying as high as, yet the number is smaller, and that's the confusing part about aperture. When someone tells you that you have to increase your aperture, you're actually reducing your numbers, right? So let's say f1.2, f1.8, f2.8, those are high apertures, but f2.8 is lower than f1.2. f1.2 is a higher aperture, right? So when I tell you to increase your aperture, in essence you should know that you're reducing your numbers. So once you figured out that number confusion, everything becomes simple. So what happens is a higher aperture brings in more light, and a lower aperture brings in less light. These images here can help you understand what I mean by a high aperture. When you look at this image here, you see that the distance between the opening and let's say the lens is small, but the opening is quite wide, so that's why it's called a high aperture. When you look at this lower image here, the distance between the opening and the lens is big, meaning the hole which the light passes through is small. That's why we call it a low aperture, because the light entering is little. Besides light, like I said earlier on, the exposure triangle has a duality. There's two sides to each of these elements. So the second side is the artistic side, and for aperture it's what we call depth of field, for some people the blurry background, the one that everybody wants to get, right? A higher aperture will give you a shallow depth of field. For example, it will cover this from here up to me, so that is the distance it will cover. Everything behind me is blurry. For example, right now I think I'm shooting at f1.8, and that's a high aperture, right? If I lowered my aperture and took it to f5.6, you would start to see more of my background, right? Because now depth of field is becoming wider. It's not as shallow as just here, but now it's increasing in distance, so that's a wider depth of field. That's the artistic part of it. If you want to, for example, if you're taking a portrait, you may not necessarily want the background, right? You will have to use a high aperture. But if you're taking a group photo and there are stacks, right? It's a group photo and there are 3 lines of people. If you use the high aperture of 2.8, only the people in front would have focus. Everybody behind would be blurry. So you have to lower your aperture to make sure each of those lines of people is covered with focus. Or if you're shooting a landscape photo, right? When you're doing landscape photography, you don't need a high aperture. So even if you're a landscape photographer, you may not necessarily need to buy a lens which has higher apertures, right? But if you're a portrait photographer, you definitely need a lens with a high aperture. The next thing to talk about is the shutter speed. Once the light has passed through your lens, it meets the shutter. Now the shutter speed basically is how fast your shutter will open and close. Speed is measured as 1 over f, if you remember your physics. So that 1 over f is your shutter speed. Whenever you see 1 over a number, that is your shutter speed. Now if you increase it past a second and maybe 2 seconds, on a camera it usually showcases as, with quotation marks on the right, you see something like 2 data. That is meaning it's too open for 2 seconds. So that's something like pa pa. Now imagine your lens is open for that long. That's a lot of light entering, right? But if your lens opens for just a second or a fraction of a second, yeah, it's a very short time, so that's very little light. The faster your camera opens and closes, less light. But the slower your camera opens and closes, the more light you allow in. Now what's the second thing the shutter speed does? Take for example, if you were at your window and you opened your window for a long time and there was maybe children running across, you would see that whole motion of the children running from one side to another, right? But if you opened your window and it was, you might have just seen them at that particular point, right? So what does that mean? I shoot a lot of church photography and there's a lot of praise. Someone is dancing, someone is jumping. If you want to capture them mid-air, if your lens is open for a long time, you will get that whole motion, so you won't capture them mid-air. But if your shutter speed is, you capture that precise moment when they were mid-air, right? So if you're shooting something that's moving fast, a car, people are playing football, people are praising, you need a fast shutter speed, right? And if you're shooting a stationary object, your shutter speed does not need to be fast. Now a cheat code here, you don't have to take it, is I usually use 1 over 125, or that's 125th of a second as my zero. Like if it was a number line, 1 over 125 is my zero, because I found that that is neither too fast or neither too slow, right? And if it's a number line, the positives, meaning if you increase your shutter speed above 125, if you go 320, 640, that's a faster shutter speed. You're increasing your shutter speed. And if you go lower than that, you're reducing your shutter speed. Something to help you understand what you're dealing with. It helped me understand photography faster. What happens if someone is jumping and you open your lens for a long time, your shutter is open for a long time? That whole motion is represented in terms of blurriness. Those are the two things of shutter speed. One, if the shutter speed is fast, little light enters, but you get a steady shot. But if your shutter speed is slow, you're allowing in more light, yes, but your image may be shaky or it may be blurry. The last part is the ISO. ISO is what we find on the sensor. For example, in our old cameras, right, our DSLR cameras, when the shutter would open and close, the ISO is only dealing with that light, right? Meaning that the sensor cannot increase the light entering your camera, nor can it decrease it. It's only dealing with the light that you've allowed in through your aperture and your shutter speed. Very important to understand that. Why? Because we define ISO as artificial light, because when you increase your ISO, usually the best ISO is 100, but if you increase it to 200, 250, as you increase it, your image seems to be increasing in light. It appears to be increasing in light, but that is done artificially. The sensor is just becoming more sensitive to the light that you already allowed in, so it appears that your photo is increasing in light. The older cameras, usually the sensors were not as powerful as they are today, so what would happen is when you'd go above a certain ISO, which used to be 800, you would find that your image would crash. It would start to have noise, it would start to have digital noise, or what we call rice, right? So it wouldn't look so good, especially at night. You'd want that your aperture and shutter are the best settings, that you don't have to increase your ISO, because that's the second thing ISO does. When you increase the ISO, you start to introduce digital noise. Now cameras of today are much better. They can deal with it much better. You can increase your ISOs and get very nice photos. The digital noise is very little. We have cameras that have things like dual native ISOs, where at a certain higher ISO the circuit begins again. I won't touch that now. If you want to learn more about that, I believe Jared Dan on YouTube has done perfectly on that side. So the lower the ISO, the less sensitive your camera is to that light, but the higher your ISO, the more sensitive your camera sensor is to that light. But it comes with that caveat of digital noise. For example, let's say we are shooting at night and it's a worship session. What is my thought process, right? For example, let's say I'm shooting the choir lead. My thought process is I'm only shooting the choir lead. Everything else around does not necessarily have to be in focus. So what does that mean for my aperture? It means that I can use a high aperture, because remember, a high aperture gives you a shallow depth of field, but also it allows in more light, meaning I won't have to over increase my ISO. Then I come to my shutter speed. Since it's worship, it's not moving so fast. Remember my number line, 1/125 is my 0. I can start from there, because at 1/125 there's pretty much a lot of light entering. But if I need to reduce it to 100, I can, because he's not moving quickly. And then I come to my ISO. If by increasing my aperture and reducing my shutter speed I have not allowed in enough light, but if I have allowed in enough light, then I won't touch my ISO, right? So for example, I'll show you certain settings here of photos I took at a concert at night, and these were the settings I used during a worship session, and these are the settings I would use during a faster session. So that is a quick session, I think about 15 minutes. The video, I don't want the video to be long, but I wanted to elaborate as much as I could so that you can understand this. You can always come back to this video as you're learning. It's important to read and learn about the ISO over and over again. I always tell people I get the opportunity to teach. You need to learn the ISO almost for 3 months. Before you even go to framing, composition, learn the ISO. Most photographers sometimes just start using artificial light without understanding how to use their manual light, and it's not the right way to learn photography, I've seen as I've grown. So I hope this was helpful for you. Come back to it whenever you need to. Share it with somebody who you think wants to learn photography. It will always be up on YouTube, and that's probably a selfish reason as to why I created it, that whenever someone wants to learn photography, I'm going to send them here. But anyway, hope it helps you understand photography more. We shall be having a part 2 where we shall be looking at the camera body. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell to get notified whenever we post a video. I'll see you guys in the next one, and hey, always remember to deliver a feeling. Peace. That when camera hits your light, when camera hits your camera, when light hits your camera, I hope you're not hearing the child crying, manange. So don't, mom is not beating him.